August 1944. A wheat field in Normandy. A German officer kneels behind a burned-out American Sherman tank. He lifts the lid of a metal box welded to the rear hull. Inside is a telephone. He is a professional soldier. He has spent 20 years studying the equipment of every army that has fought Germany. And he cannot, for the life of him, explain what is inside this box. To understand what he is looking at, you have to go back 6 weeks. To a dirt lane south of St. Lo, to a sergeant in a ditch, screaming at a tank that cannot hear him. A field in Normandy, July 9, 1944. What follows is drawn from the after-action reports of the 743rd Tank Battalion and the 120th Infantry Regiment. It is a kind of moment that happened 100 times that week. A dirt lane south of Saint-Jean-de-Day. The hedgerows rise on both sides like green walls, 6 feet of packed earth crowned with hawthorn and elm. The lanes here are older than the United States. They were old when Napoleon marched through them. A Sherman sits at the bend, 30 tons of American steel, engine idling, hatches sealed. Its 75mm gun is pointed at a wall of vegetation 30 feet ahead. Behind it, the Continental radial engine throbs at over 110 decibels. Loud enough to permanently damage hearing without protection. Inside the tank, 4 men. The commander has his face pressed to the periscope, scanning a strip of world he cannot see clearly. The gunner watches a screen of green leaves. The driver and his assistant stare through letterbox slits 4 inches wide. They are deaf to the world outside their hull. Their headphones carry only the crackle of the platoon net and the breathing of the men beside them. 40 feet to the left, in a drainage ditch choked with nettles, a sergeant from the 120th Infantry Regiment is screaming. He can see the muzzle flash, a German machine gun. 2nd floor, the stone farmhouse beyond the hedge. He has been watching it for 90 seconds. He pounds the hull of the tank with his fist, nothing. He stands up, waves both arms, the turret does not move. He scoops a clod of dirt and throws it at the commander's hatch. The dirt strikes the steel and crumbles into nothing. The hatch stays shut. The hatch stays shut because the last tank commander on this road who opened his cupola took a sniper round through the forehead 2 hours ago. The sergeant drops back into the ditch. The machine gun keeps firing, and 30 tons of American steel sits 20 yards away, carrying a 75mm cannon, 2 machine guns, and 4 men who cannot hear a single word he is saying. This is the problem that will kill more American tankers and infantrymen in Normandy than any German weapon. Not the Panther, not the Tiger, not the 88, not the Panzerfaust. The thing that is destroying American combined arms in the summer of 1944 is silence. Tanks cannot hear infantry. Infantry cannot talk to tanks. And in about 2 weeks, one officer in one tank battalion will solve this problem in a single night, with a piece of equipment from 1938. In a box that used to hold machine gun ammunition, for less than the cost of a pair of boots. But to understand what he did, you have to understand what they had. And what they did not. Here is what most people do not know about the American army that landed at Normandy. It had built something no other army in the world possessed. Not the British, not the Soviets, not the Wehrmacht, for all of their reputation. The Americans had created 65 separate tank battalions, not part of armored divisions, not designed for sweeping breakthroughs. They existed for a single, specific purpose, to be attached to infantry divisions, to fight beside men on foot, the 743rd 6th, the 748th, dozens of them. In the army's own words, they were the infantry's armour. On paper, the doctrine was elegant. An infantry division hits a fortified position, a pillbox, a stone farmhouse, a hedgerow bristling with machine guns. The infantry calls forward a platoon of Shermans. The tanks pound the position with high explosive. The infantry manoeuvres around it, steel and flesh, each one covering the weakness of the other. The Germans had panzer divisions, but those were built around the tank. The British had infantry tanks, but they kept armour and infantry in separate worlds. Only the Americans had built an entire organizational structure whose sole reason for existing was to serve the riflemen. It was, in theory, the most sophisticated combined arms doctrine any army had ever attempted. And it contained a problem so simple, so absurd, that when you hear it, you may wonder how an army that mass-produced 50,000 tanks could not solve it before men started dying. The tanks and the infantry could not talk to each other. Not wouldn't, could not. This is the part where the records get interesting. Because the popular version of this story, the one you may have heard, will tell you that the American radios used different modulation systems. That the tank radio was AM and the infantry radio was FM, and that the incompatibility was a kind of technical accident, like plugging an American appliance into a European wall. It is not true. The infantry's SCR 300, the manpack radio that every infantry company commander carried, operated on FM frequency modulation, 40 to 48 MHz. The tank's SCR 508, mounted inside every Sherman that landed on Omaha in Utah, also operated on FM frequency modulation, 20 to 27.9 MHz. Both radios used the same technology, the same modulation, the same principle of physics, but they were tuned to entirely separate bands, as separate as a kitchen radio and a police scanner. You could put a tank and a rifle squad in the same field, give them the same orders, train them together for a year, and the moment the shooting started and the hatches came down, the two radios, one in the tank, one on the infantryman's back, were as useful to each other as a telephone and a flashlight. This is worse than a technical failure. This is two pieces of equipment, built by the same army for the same army, by engineers who shared the same supply system, who somehow shipped into the field two voices that could not hear each other. And the army knew it. There was an official solution, there always is. It was called the ANVRC-3, a radio designed to be mounted inside a Sherman and tuned to the infantry frequency band. On paper, it was exactly what the situation required. It weighed 34 pounds. It used the same receiver as the infantry manpack. It was by every specification on the paper that designed it the correct answer. In Normandy, in July 1944, almost none had arrived. The ones that had reached the front were unreliable. And even when they worked, they solved only half the problem. Half. The infantry officer with a matching radio could now talk to the tank. The rifleman in the ditch could not. The sergeant pounding the hull, the corporal hiding behind the farmhouse wall, the private who could see the muzzle flash from 40 feet away. For the man at the bottom of the chain of command, the man who could actually see the enemy, the ANVRC-3 was nothing. He still had to bang on the hull with his rifle butt. He still had to throw rocks. He still had to run out in front of the tank and wave his arms, standing in the open between American armor and German guns, hoping the driver was looking through a 4-inch window at that exact second. Men died doing this, not occasionally, routinely. By the first week of July, the German defenders were beginning to notice. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division held the line in front of Saint-Lô. Paratroopers, many of them young men, 18 and 19 years old, drafted into a war their fathers had started, fed into a defensive line they could not hope to hold. Their commander was General Lieutenant Richard Schimpf, 47 years old, born in 1897, a career officer who had served in the First World War as a teenager, who had spent 2 decades watching the German army tear itself down and build itself back up, who had been given command of this division in February. In the first week of July, Schimpf began writing something into his situation reports that should have terrified the Allied command if it had reached them. His young soldiers were losing their fear of American tanks, not because the Shermans were weak. The Shermans were, by every measurable standard, the better instrument. More of them, more fuel, more ammunition, more reliable. But Schimpf's men had discovered a pattern. They had learned, in 2 weeks of hedgerow fighting, that a Sherman without its infantry was not a predator. It was prey. Isolate the tank, let it grind forward into the field, move a Panzerfaust team along the bank, strike the engine deck from 40 yards. 3 to 5 seconds before the ammunition cooked off, the Wehrmacht was not winning in Normandy. They were losing badly, falling back, bleeding out. But in those individual moments, in those individual fields, 18-year-olds with hollow charges were defeating 30-ton machines because the machines could not hear the men beside them. Schimpf's report did not reach the Allied command. It would not be read until after the war. But somewhere on the American side of the line in the first week of July, the same pattern was reaching the desk of a man named William D. Duncan, Lieutenant Colonel, commander of the 743rd Tank Battalion. Duncan had taken command of this unit in mid-June. He had inherited it from his predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel John S. Upham Jr., who had led the 743rd onto Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th and been wounded before noon, Duncan was looking at his casualty lists. He was looking at his daily reports. He was looking at descriptions of Shermans burning in fields where the infantry had been 50 yards behind, where one man with a radio could have saved a crew, where the gap between his tanks and the riflemen beside them was being measured in lives, and Duncan called in his operations officer. A captain, Edward G. Miller, before the war a signal soldier, a man who understood wires and frequencies and handsets the way a mechanic understands engines. The historical record, the official unit history of the 743rd Tank Battalion, would never write down what Duncan said to him that evening. What followed survived only because an account was preserved outside the official record in a family memoir that would not surface for decades. According to that account, Duncan gave Miller a single order. Fix it. Tonight. The sun was going down over Normandy. The hedgerows were turning black against an orange sky, and somewhere south of St. Lo, in the language of the artillery, the night was waking up. Captain Miller went looking for a telephone. The motor pool at the 743rd's bivouac that night smelled of diesel and wet canvas and the faint, sweet rot of Norman apples falling somewhere outside the perimeter. What we know of Captain Miller's night is what the equipment tells us, and what the result tells us. Miller had a battalion's worth of stores to draw from. He had a welding kit. He had supply tents holding standard issue items waiting to be issued, and he had a problem so simple that any private could see it, and so impossible that an army of 3.5 million men had not solved it in 2 years of preparing for this war. Miller did not invent anything that night. That is the part the story always misses. Miller did not design new equipment. He did not engineer anything. He did not consult a manual or sketch a blueprint. He took 2 things the United States Army already had in vast quantities in every supply dump in Normandy, and he put them together in a way no one had bothered to try. The first thing was a field telephone. The EE-8 was older than the war. The Army had standardized it in 1938, 6 years old by the time it reached Norman dirt. A handset, a magneto ringer that you cranked by hand, a simple carbon microphone that converted the vibration of a human voice into a varying electrical current, no batteries required for voice transmission. The act of speaking generated the signal. In every infantry company in the United States Army a man carried an EE-8. They were as common as canteens. They were as ancient, by the standards of 1944, as a horse-drawn wagon. You could find one within 100 yards of any headquarters in Normandy. The second thing was an empty ammunition box. The 30 caliber machine gun ate ammunition in belts of 250 rounds, packaged in olive drab metal cans that latch shut with a steel clasp, 8 inches by 4 inches by 10. Every Sherman in Normandy carried dozens. When the belts ran out, the cans were thrown away. They piled by the side of every road the American Army had ever marched down. What Miller did between sundown on July 9th and sunrise on July 10th was this. He took the EE-8 handset out of its canvas case. He drilled a small hole into the rear hull of a Sherman from the 743rd's headquarters platoon. The armor was 1.5 inches thick at that point. The drill bit chewed through it with the sound of a dental procedure. He ran a length of standard signal wire through the hole. Inside the tank, he wired the handset into the existing intercom system, the same system the commander used to talk to his driver and his gunner. Outside the tank, on the rear hull plate, he bolted an empty 30 caliber ammunition box. He placed the handset inside the box. He closed the lid. That was it. Any infantryman walking up to the back of that Sherman could now open the box, lift the handset to his ear, and speak directly into the headphones of the tank commander. No radio. No frequency matching. No 34-pound backpack, a handset, a wire, a box, and 6 years of an existing supply chain waiting to be repurposed. The sun came up over Normandy on the morning of July 10th. Miller showed his work to Lieutenant Colonel Duncan. We do not know exactly what Duncan said. We know what he did. He authorized the installation of identical telephone boxes on every Sherman in the 743rd, and he ordered his battalion intelligence officer to drive the prototype to the headquarters of the 30th Infantry Division and present the concept to the division command. The 30th had been welded to the 743rd since the beginning. They were a partnership. The riflemen of the 30th had been the ones throwing rocks at Duncan's tanks. They had been the ones dying because the tanks could not hear them. When the officer arrived at division headquarters with a Sherman that had a phone on its back, the 30th did not need to be persuaded. They needed to be issued more boxes. What happened in the days that followed has no official paper trail. There was no Army directive ordering the installation of infantry telephones on American tanks. No procurement document, no technical bulletin from Washington. The history of the Sherman tank, the volumes written about it in the decades since the war, contain no notice of a meeting or a memorandum that ordered this change. What happened is that ordnance teams across the Normandy beachhead began doing it on their own. A maintenance company would learn about the phones from a tanker who came in for repairs. The maintenance company would weld boxes onto the tanks they were fixing. Tankers from another battalion would see the boxes and ask. The maintenance company would weld more boxes onto more tanks. The boxes spread laterally, virally, without permission, the way good ideas spread in a country where any man with a wrench considers himself an engineer. 6,000 miles away, in the Pacific, on an island that most Americans had never heard of until that summer, the same thing was happening. Saipan. June 15, 1944, the Marines went ashore. By mid-July, they were fighting their way through volcanic ridges and sugarcane fields against a Japanese garrison that had been ordered to die in place. The Marine tankers fought from M4A2 Shermans, with diesel engines instead of gasoline, the same hull, the same gun, the same problem. Their infantry could not talk to them. Somewhere in the Marine motor pool on Saipan, in roughly the same week Miller was drilling his hole in Normandy, Marines began welding telephone boxes onto the backs of their tanks. The accounts that survived describe the boxes being cut from 1-inch armor plate, heavier than what Miller used, more improvised, but the same idea, the same wire, the same handset. The same insight. No one coordinated this, no one had to. 2 oceans, 2 services, 2 enemies, the same problem in 2 different jungles, 2 different terrains, 2 different wars. And in 2 different motor pools, in 2 different hemispheres, in roughly the same week, American soldiers reached for the same tool. It was not a doctrine they shared, it was a culture. A culture that did not assume that a problem in the field had to be solved by an office in Washington, that assumed, in fact, the opposite. That assumed that the men closest to the problem would see the solution first, and that the only thing the army needed to do was get out of their way. The men in the field did not wait for permission, they never had. By July 25th, 2 weeks after Miller's night, Operation Cobra began. This was the breakout, the end of the bocage fighting. The moment when American forces would finally tear themselves loose from the Norman hedgerows and begin the long sweep across France toward the German border. It opened with the largest carpet bombing in the history of warfare to that point. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, dropped their loads on a rectangle of Norman farmland 3.5 miles wide and a mile deep. The target was a stretch of road called the Perrier-Saint-Lô Highway, and behind it the positions of the German Panzerlehr Division, an elite armoured formation that had been chewed apart in the previous weeks, but was still holding the line. The bombs fell, and some of them fell short. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair stood at the front edge of the American line that morning, observing the bombardment. McNair was 61 years old. He had been born in 1883, the son of a Minnesota family. He had spent the entire war training the army that was now in Normandy. He had personally shaped the doctrine, the structure, the equipment, the entire way the United States Army would fight in 1944. He had earned the right to see it work. He was killed by an American bomb. He died alongside men of the 30th Infantry Division, the same division that was, at that moment, fielding the first Shermans with telephone boxes welded to their hulls. The 30th, which had bled for 2 months to learn what the bocage taught, lost more than 100 men that morning to its own air force. McNair was buried in Normandy, the highest-ranking American killed in the European theatre by friendly fire on the morning the doctrine he had built was about to prove itself in steel and blood. The men of the 30th picked themselves up out of the craters and went forward. The tanks of the 7th and 43rd went with them. A few weeks before Cobra, in another field workshop in Normandy, a sergeant from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had been working on his own problem. His name was Curtis G. Cullen III, 28 years old. Born in 1915, he had a sergeant's stripes and a welding torch and a wrecker's eye for what could be cut apart and rebuilt. Cullen had seen the same thing every American in Normandy had seen. The Shermans could not climb the hedgerow banks. When they tried, they tipped backwards, exposing their thin belly armor to anti-tank fire from the next field. The standard procedure was to blow a hole in the bank with engineers and shaped charges, which announced your intentions to every German within a mile. Cullen looked at the steel beach obstacles that Field Marshal Rommel had planted along the Norman coast. Those obstacles were now being cleared from the beaches by the thousands. They were piled by the roadsides. They were free for the taking. Cullen cut them apart with a torch. He welded the resulting steel teeth onto the bow of a Sherman. He took the tank to a hedgerow and rammed it. The teeth bit into the earth bank. The tank went through, not over. Its belly armor stayed where the Germans could not reach it. Cullen showed it to a colonel. The colonel showed it to a general. The general was Omar Bradley. Bradley watched it work in a Norman field on July 4 days after Miller's Night and approved it on the spot. Within 10 days, ordnance companies up and down the American front were cutting up the remains of the Atlantic Wall and welding it onto the bows of their Shermans. By the time Cobra began on the 25th, hundreds of Shermans were rolling into battle with two things they had not possessed at the start of the month: the teeth on the front, to go through walls, and the box on the back, to listen to the men outside. By every measure of military history that anyone had written before 1944, the Wehrmacht should not have been losing in Normandy. The German army had invented combined arms warfare in its modern form. They had written the book on how tanks and infantry fight together. They had spent the years between 1935 and 1939 perfecting a doctrine that had then conquered most of Europe in 18 months. The German tank-infantry partnership was called Panzergrenadier. The word itself was new. It had been coined to describe a new kind of soldier, not regular infantry, not regular armor, a hybrid, a man who fought alongside tanks, who rode in vehicles that could keep pace with armor across rough country, who was trained from his first day in uniform to operate as part of an armored team. The vehicle was the SDKFZ 251, an armored half-track, tracked rear, wheeled front. It could carry 10 men. It mounted a machine gun. It had radios tuned to the tank net of the division it served. Its commander could speak directly to the tank platoon leader. Its dismounted soldiers could remount on the move. The whole formation could shift from steel to flesh to steel again without losing momentum. It was, in its conception, exactly what the Bocage was punishing the Americans for not having. And here is the part of the story that the textbooks do not tell you. Of every 4 Panzer Grenadier battalions in a German panzer division, only one of them actually rode in those armoured half-tracks. The other 3 rode in trucks. This was not a temporary shortage. This was the structure of the army. The SDKFZ 251 was expensive. The Wehrmacht never built enough of them. The Panzer Grenadier divisions were, by mid-1944, a paper concept on top of a reality that looked nothing like the brochure. 3 out of every 4 Panzer Grenadier battalions could move with the tanks only as long as the road was solid and the firing had not started. The moment the trucks could not follow the tanks across a cratered field, or through a hedgerow gap, or into the fire of a forward outpost, the trucks stopped, the men got out. And they became regular infantry on foot, walking, crawling, trying to keep up with armor that had now left them behind. When they were on foot, they had no way to talk to the tanks ahead of them, no radio, no telephone. No mechanism in their entire doctrine for an enlisted man on the ground to communicate directly with the tank crew. That was the Panzer Grenadier divisions, the elite of the elite. The branch the Germans had built specifically to fix the problem the Americans were now fixing with an ammunition box and 20 feet of wire. By the summer of 1944, the German army fielded roughly 300 divisions. They were strung from the gates of Leningrad to the foothills of the Pyrenees, from the fjords of Norway to the deserts north of Tobruk. 300 divisions of every type and every quality. Fewer than 30 of them were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions. The other 270 were infantry divisions, static divisions. Reserve divisions, Volksgrenadier divisions, formed from the bones of units that had been destroyed elsewhere, men who marched on foot, supplies that moved by horse, artillery that was pulled by mules. When these divisions received tank support, and in Normandy they often did, because the panzer divisions were parcelled out in fragments along the front to plug holes, the tanks arrived as strangers. A company of Panthers attached to an infantry regiment for 48 hours, no shared training, no shared radio net, no shared language of cooperation. The Panther commander decided what to shoot. The infantry adapted or did not. If the infantry wanted the tank to engage a specific target, the company commander had to find the tank platoon leader physically, on foot. In the middle of a firefight, he had to request the engagement verbally or send a runner, or fire a coloured signal flare and hope the tankers knew the code. There was no mechanism anywhere in the German army for an enlisted infantryman to speak directly to a tank crew. It was not a question of equipment. The Germans had field telephones. They had welders, they had wire, they had every piece of hardware that Miller had used on his Sherman in Normandy. What they did not have was the thought. The thought that a private should be able to direct the fire of a Panther. The thought that the man at the bottom of the chain of command might know something the man at the top did not. The thought that the chain of command itself might be the wrong shape for the kind of war that was happening in the hedgerows. The Germans were a vertical army. Information flowed up the chain in the form of reports. Orders flowed down the chain in the form of directives. The man at the top knew. The man at the bottom obeyed. It was an army that could be trusted to execute a plan with extraordinary precision. It was not an army that could be trusted to invent solutions in a motor pool overnight. By the middle of August, something had changed in the way the American tanks behaved. The Panzerfaust teams of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division had spent 6 weeks learning to kill Shermans. They had learned the timing. They had learned the angles. They had learned how to read the hesitation of a tank without its infantry. They had begun to feel, in the way veteran soldiers feel things, that the math was working in their favour. And then the math broke. The Shermans were no longer grinding forward blind. They were pausing at the hedgerow lines, traversing their turrets onto targets that should have been invisible from inside the turret. They were firing on Panzerfaust teams from 100 yards away, before the teams could shoulder their weapons, as if the tank commander had been told exactly where to look. Sometimes the tankers were firing on positions that lay behind a hedgerow not visible from any periscope or vision slit on the vehicle. Sometimes the turrets were tracking targets the crew could not possibly have seen. General Lieutenant Schimpf, the 47-year-old Prussian commanding the division, began to notice these reports stacking up on his desk. His young paratroopers, the ones who had begun to lose their fear of American tanks in early July, were now writing accounts that read almost like accusations. The Shermans, they said, could see through the hedgerows. Schimpf did not believe in tanks that could see through walls. He believed in coordinated arms. He believed in trained doctrine. He believed in the chain of command. He understood that the Americans had improved their tactics. He understood that the weight of bombing and the weight of materiel was changing the balance against him. He understood by the middle of August that the war in Normandy was lost. What he did not understand, what he had no framework to understand, was that the change in his enemy's behavior was not a tactical adjustment. It was not a new doctrine. It was not a fresh general or a different division. It was a small metal box the size of a canteen bolted to the back of every American tank he was now fighting. And neither Schimpf nor anyone in his army would understand what they were looking at until the wrecks began to fall into German hands, and by then the war had already turned. The wrecks began to come. By the middle of August 1944, after Operation Cobra had torn the German line apart and the American breakout was racing east across France, the Wehrmacht was leaving Shermans behind. burning ones in fields they had abandoned, disabled ones at crossroads they could no longer hold, whole tanks that had been knocked out by retreating gun crews on the Bocage front and never recovered because the front was moving too fast. German intelligence officers had standing orders to examine captured American equipment. They had been doing it since North Africa in 1943. They knew the Sherman, they knew the Continental radial engine. They knew the 75mm M3 gun. They had measured the armor and published firing tables showing exactly where to aim to kill one with a Panzerfaust, an 88, or a Panther's high-velocity 75. But the box on the back was new. It had appeared sometime in mid-July, first on a handful of vehicles, then on more, then, by mid-August, on almost every Sherman the Germans found. A rectangular metal container, roughly the size of a .30 caliber ammunition can, because that was exactly what it was, welded or bolted to the right rear of the hull, below the engine deck. A German officer would open the lid. Inside, a standard field telephone handset, connected by a wire that ran through a hole drilled into the hull. The mechanical function was obvious. They were professionals. The handset connected to the intercom, so a man standing behind the tank could speak to the men inside. The German officers understood that in seconds. What they did not understand was why. This is where the story becomes something deeper than a story about a piece of equipment. Because the German confusion that followed, recorded in technical intelligence reports that survived the war and now sit in archives, was not a confusion about wiring or voltage or design. It was a confusion about the very shape of an army. A German officer trained in the Prussian tradition looked at the box and saw a sentence he could not finish. The tank had a commander. The commander had been trained for years to assess the battlefield, read the terrain through his optics, select his targets, coordinate with his platoon leader by radio. His decisions were informed by training, by doctrine, by the tactical picture as communicated to him through the chain of command. And someone had welded a telephone to the back of his vehicle so that any soldier who happened to be standing behind it, any rifleman, any private, any man with a working pair of hands, could pick up the handset and tell the commander what to do. In the German military framework, this was not just unusual, it was incoherent. It was as if someone had installed a second steering wheel on the outside of a locomotive so that any pedestrian could redirect the train. The system already had a commander. The commander already had a chain of command. Why would you bypass both and hand the lowest ranking man on the battlefield a direct line to the heaviest weapon in the field? The answer that no German doctrinal manual contained, that no German staff college taught, and that no German officer trained in the tradition of Prussian command hierarchy could arrive at through logic alone, was this. Because he could see what the commander could not. That is the sentence that separates the two armies. The German system trusted the chain of command. Information flowed upward through ranks, was processed by trained officers, and returned downward as orders. It was efficient, it was disciplined, it had conquered most of Europe. But it contained an assumption so deeply buried that no one questioned it, the assumption that the man with the higher rank had the better picture. The American system, by the summer of 1944, had learned something different. It had learned that in the bocage, in the jungle, in the rubble of an Italian village, the man with the best picture was not the one with the highest rank. He was the one closest to the enemy. He was the sergeant in the ditch who could see the muzzle flash. He was the corporal behind the stone wall who had spotted the anti-tank gun. He was the private at the back of the tank who knew, because he was standing in the open with bullets snapping past his head, exactly where the fire was coming from. The telephone said, "We trust that man. We trust him enough to give him a direct line to a 30-ton gun platform. We trust him enough to skip every layer of command between a rifleman and a tank commander. We trust him enough to let him say 6 words, machine gun, second floor, left window, and have the turret respond without waiting for confirmation from anyone." No army in the world had ever formalized that level of trust at the bottom of its hierarchy, and no German officer standing behind a captured Sherman in the summer of 1944 had the conceptual vocabulary to describe what he was looking at. He was looking at a doctrine. He was looking at a culture, he was looking at a country that had decided, without writing it down, without debating it in a staff college, without issuing a field manual, that the man closest to the problem was the man most qualified to solve it. The Germans could not copy this, not because they lacked wire, not because they lacked welders, not because they lacked telephones. They had all of those things in factories that were still running, in warehouses that were still stocked, in supply depots that were still intact. What copying it would have required was the dismantling of the relationship between ranks that held the German army together. Allowing a rifleman to direct tank fire meant trusting his judgment over the tank commanders in that moment. Encouraging field improvisation meant accepting that the men at the bottom might know something the men at the top did not. Spreading solutions laterally without waiting for authorization meant loosening the vertical control that German doctrine depended on. The German army was built on the principle that a well-trained officer corps applying proven doctrine through disciplined command would always outperform individual initiative at the bottom. And for 5 years that principle had been largely correct, but the principle assumed that doctrine could anticipate the battlefield. In Normandy, in the Bocage, in a war that changed shape every 2 weeks, it could not. The American army had made a different bet. It had bet that the man in the field, given a telephone and a working hand, would solve faster than any doctrine could anticipate. The 743rd Tank Battalion stayed with the 30th Infantry Division for the rest of the war, from the hedgerows of Normandy through the breakout at Saint-Lô. Through the Battle of Mortain in August, where the 30th held the line against a desperate German counterattack aimed at cutting off Patton's spearhead, a stand so fierce that the Germans gave the 30th a name no other American division received. They called them Roosevelt's SS, through Belgium in September, through the Siegfried Line in October, through the frozen hell of the Ardennes in December, when elements of the 743rd fought the 1st SS Panzer Division around Stoumont and Laglaise, in a battle the world would remember as the defeat of Kampfgruppe Pieper, through the Roer River in February of 1945, through the Rhine in March, and finally on April 13, 1945, to a railroad siding outside a small German town called Farsleben. A sergeant in a light tank from the 743rd spotted the train first, boxcars, dozens of them, sitting motionless on the Magdeburg to Wittenberg line. The doors were open, people were climbing out. Skeletal, hollow-eyed, wearing the striped rags of the camps, approximately 2,500 prisoners from Bergen-Belsen, most of them Jews, many of them women and children, being transported deeper into the collapsing Reich to be murdered before the Allied armies could reach them. The guards had abandoned the train when they heard American engines coming down the road. The tankers of the 743rd, the infantrymen of the 30th, the same men who had 10 months earlier been throwing rocks at unhearing armour in a Norman lane, they climbed down from their vehicles. They secured the train, they scrounged food from the surrounding German villages, they carried water, they carried the ones who could not walk, they stood guard. 4 days later the battalion reached the Elbe River, their final stop line. The Soviets were on the far bank. The war in Europe was for them over. The 743rd Tank Battalion lost 96 Shermans during the war. They lost 141 men killed in action, 22 missing, 316 wounded, total casualties 479. Roughly equal to the full strength of the battalion. They had burned through their own number and kept fighting. Captain Edward G. Miller, the signal officer who had wired a telephone into an ammunition box one night in July 1944, survived the war. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews. He returned to the United States and lived quietly, the way most of them did. His contribution was not recorded in the official unit history of the 743rd. It was preserved by his family. His son-in-law, decades later, posted the story on a website dedicated to the Sherman tank. That is how we know his name. The telephone he built did not remain a field improvisation for long. By late 1944, the Army standardized the infantry phone as a factory-installed feature on new Shermans. After the war, every American tank, the M26 Pershing, the M47 Pattons, the M48, the M60, carried an infantry telephone box as standard equipment. For 40 years it was as much a part of an American tank as its gun or its engine. Then, in 1980, the M1 Abrams entered service without one. The designers decided the phone was obsolete. Infantry could communicate by radio now. Encryption had improved. Doctrine had moved on. For 26 years, American tankers and infantrymen fought without it. In 2006, in the streets of Baghdad and Ramadi, the army discovered that the same problem Captain Miller had solved in a Norman hedgerow was back. Infantrymen crouching behind an Abrams in an urban firefight could not tell the crew where the fire was coming from. Radio frequencies were crowded. Encryption added delay. And the turbine engine of the Abrams was so loud that shouting through the hull was useless. The army issued an upgrade called the Tank Urban Survivability Kit to us. One of its components was an infantry telephone mounted on the rear hull of the M1A2 Abrams. 62 years after a captain in Normandy wired a field telephone into an ammunition box, the United States Army arrived at the same answer. The same handset, the same location, the same wire into the intercom, the same quiet admission that the man closest to the enemy is the man who needs to talk to the tank. The Germans could not explain the phone because it did not solve a German problem. In their army, the tank did not serve the rifleman served the tank. Communication flowed from the top, not from the bottom, and the idea that a private, tired, scared, crouching in a ditch with mud on his face and a handset against his ear might know more about the battlefield than the commander of a 50-ton Panther was not a thought the German system was built to think. The Americans thought it, not in a staff college, not in a planning document, in a field workshop, in one night. With a telephone and a welding torch and an empty ammunition box that had once held the brass rounds of a .30 caliber machine gun, and the war turned on things like that. Small, cheap, human things that no procurement office would have approved and no doctrine manual would have predicted. A telephone in a box, 20 feet of wire. And the radical, unreasonable, deeply American idea that the man at the bottom of the chain might be the most important man on the field.